Welcome to day 2 of the Conference on Texas. We are here to explore old traditions, new ideas, and today we're pleased to start with Elvira Kisser Sanchez from the Archdiocese of San Antonio. She's the chief archivist there and has helped us with numerous exhibitions, wonderful artifacts, and this will be a great presentation to explore how the missions came to be and the conditions of the Indians who met them. So, here's Elvira.
Good morning. Like she said, my name is Elvira Sanchez Kisser. I'm the Director of Archives and Records Management for the Archdiocese of San Antonio Archives, which, yes, we do have many different early registers and repositories of materials that are close to the founding of San Antonio. I do want to introduce our 2 speakers today that will be talking on Catholic Indians and how they met the Catholic Church. Well, our first speaker is going to be Mickey Killian. Mickey Killian was born in San Antonio, Texas, raised near San Juan Capistrano Mission, and is the 6th generation of his family to live in proximity to the mission. He graduated from Brackenridge High School in San Antonio, Texas, and graduated from the University of Texas at the Permian Basin with a Bachelor of Business and Administrative degree in accounting in 1977. In 1980, he became a Texas Certified Public Accountant and was employed by the United States Treasury Department. He has been involved in genealogical and historical research regarding the San Antonio missions and missions family since his retirement in 1997. Mickey Killian will be talking about the evolution of the Native Americans in South Texas. In the 1700s, the world of the Native Americans were changed drastically. These changes were brought about by the influence of the advancing Europeans, the Catholic mission system, and by the disturbances These changes were brought about by the influence of the advancing Europeans, the Catholic mission system, and by the disturbances caused by the warlike tribes. He will be discussing the choices the Native Americans were presented with and the effects to their culture. Our second speaker will be Rebecca Simmons. Rebecca Simmons is the Executive Director of Las Misiones, the organization charged with preservation and conservation of the 4 San Antonio Spanish colonial mission churches. She also serves as the director of El Camino de San Antonio Missions, a program of the Archdiocese of San Antonio. She's a graduate of Austin College and Baylor University School of Law. She is a formal trial and appellate judge who has authored and presented numerous articles on a variety of legal topics. Long fascinated by the missions, Rebecca continues to study their history and continuing contribution to San Antonio. Rebecca will be focusing on the role of the Franciscans in the founding and serving in the San Antonio missions. She will discuss their role in evangelization and methods of indoctrinating the indigenous people in the area in the Catholic faith and the Spanish culture. So we're going to start with Mickey Killian. If you guys would give a round of applause.
Thank you. I've only got 20 minutes, so I don't know how I'm going to do it, but we're going to try. Let's see, do we have, we don't have our, do we have our, there we go. There we go. Native Americans have been here in South Texas area for a long time. If you ask a Native American, they'll say, many of them will say they've been here forever. But something like 20,000 years or thereabouts. This scenario here was duplicated here many times, and of course this could have happened right around here somewhere, where these big animals, big fauna, megafauna they call them, used to thrive along the San Antonio River. The Europeans had the same scenario probably in Britain and Europe. 500 years ago, of course, things were vastly different. In South Texas and northern Mexico, there were many, many small bands or tribes of indigenous people. Usually, these bands were 40 to 50 folks, sometimes more. The reason they were small is that the environment, the semi-arid environment of this area, made the fact that the game and so forth was depleted after a while, so they had to move on. They were semi-nomadic people. They would come to the same sites year after year. For example, there was one group here in San Antonio called Maraquito, or Malaquito, depending on which Spanish version you looked at. But they would spend their winters down at the coast, and then they would come up to San Antonio, this area, as the weather warmed. And they later were involved in the Espada building and construction. They had these tribes had differing customs, differing languages even. Here in Texas, here in South Texas, there was a lingua franca, which was Coahuilteco. They called Coahuilteco, but this term didn't come about until 1860. But this particular language was common. However, not all these groups spoke this language. There was different languages. For example, there was a tribe called the Borrado tribe, which was from the coastal area of South Texas. They spoke a different language. What happened was, what started the whole problem with the natives here was that the Spanish landed at Veracruz, Mexico in 1519. At that time, the die was cast for the changes to come. The Spanish used their Indian allies, which were numerous. The Spanish only had 300 folks come ashore. And they used the Tlaxcalan people, which had thousands and thousands of warriors. They defeated the Aztecs in 1521. Now, that was 1521. Now, the Spanish expeditions didn't come into Texas until 1689. So what happened in those 200 years? There's a lot going on in Mexico, a lot of changes. And there was expeditions up towards northern Mexico and northeastern Mexico. There were established towns of Monclova, Coahuila, Monclova, and Saltillo, and San Luis Potosí. All these towns were colonized by Tlaxcalan Indian people. There was an Indian town at each of these cities. Now, on the expeditions, the Spanish expeditions that came in, every expedition had an Indian guide or a native guide. They could not. The Spanish themselves couldn't find the water or the pasturage for their horses, or the trails, so they relied on Native Americans. So at the head of every Spanish expedition, there were Native Americans, and also we had the interpreters. They had to have somebody interpret, so they had interpreters. So it was not a totally Spanish-driven expedition. When you have an expedition, there's Native Americans involved also. In 1689, the Spanish heard that there was a French settlement somewhere around Matagorda Bay. And this was the impetus for them to send an expedition to try and root these people out, because after all, this was Spanish territory. So they, in 1689, Don Alonso de Leon, he was governor of Coahuila, he was commander of the Presidio of Coahuila. He came into Texas with an expedition to try and root out those pesky French people. But when he got to the Matagorda Bay, he found that the settlement had been pretty well demolished. They had been attacked by Indians, and the people either killed or scattered. In 1690, there was another expedition, but this expedition was to found a mission, and they went to East Texas, and among the Hasinai Confederacy, they founded the first Texas mission called San Francisco de los Tejas on June the 1st, 1690. Now, the word Texas comes from what Father Solis wrote in 1768, was that the natives called the Friends Techi. And the Spanish, when they wrote it, they used the plural techas. And it subsequently evolved to Texas. So, and the land west or east of the Medina was called Provincia de los Tejas, or province of the Texas, for a while. Now, the mission system was a construct of the Spanish to bring the Indians in, the natives in, and keep them teach them the skills and so forth, farming, animal husbandry and so forth. And after 10 years, the Spanish thought, well, the natives will be okay, and they'll be Spanish citizens, they'll be indoctrinated in the Spanish language and so forth. But that was a difficult situation. The mission would have to be built or established near a water source so they could have water for their crops, and this was always a consideration for building a mission. In the spring of 1691, there was another expedition. This time, the expedition, instead of going south towards like Matagorda Bay, it came up north. So it came up this way, and the Spanish arrived at a place called what the natives called Uwanawana. Now you hear the term Yanawana, but the priest wrote Uwanawana, so there's a little bit of difference there. I guess maybe Yanawana is maybe easier to pronounce. The expedition arrived at a village of the Payaya Indians on June 13th, 1691, and it happened to be the feast day of St. Anthony of Padua, so they named it San Antonio de Padua. They stayed there 2 days, and on the 15th of June, they crossed the river. There's no mention at this time that they named the river, whatever, some people will tell you that the river was named on this date, but that's not true. They didn't, as far as the records show. Then in 1709, there was another expedition, but this was more of a reconnaissance expedition. This expedition was to go to East Texas and find out what the Hasinai Indians were, what their attitude was towards missions. in 17, they came this way. They came up north also, and they arrived at a village on the Medina of the Pampua tribe, and the Pampua guided them into this area, and the priests came into the San Pedro Creek, and the priest named it Aguas de San Pedro. And then on the same day, a little later on, they came to the springs, the headwaters there of the San Antonio, and the priest remarked that the water was so copious that it could serve not only a village, but it could serve a city. So that was, I guess, more of a looking into the future, I guess. And that was on 1709. So San Antonio River wasn't named until they named it San Antonio River, but until 1709. So it was 18 years after the people came to south of San Antonio there. By the way, there's one priest says, Habig, said that the expedition in 1691 crossed the river where San Juan Capistrano Mission is today. But he's speculating, of course. There's no proof of that, but I would seem to think that's probably correct. The Spanish missions in East Texas were a long ways from the bases in Mexico. So the Spanish and church authorities decided to put a halfway point somewhere. So they decided on San Pedro Creek, and they would bring a mission from, they would transfer a mission from south of the border, San Francisco Solano, to that area and rename it. They renamed it San Antonio de Valero, which is, of course, the Alamo, but it was on San Pedro Creek. And that was moved a couple of times to the present location. And I think the cornerstone of the present church wasn't laid until 1744. So the Alamo Church was really, or the Alamo Mission, the Valero Mission was really a transplant. In 1720, so that was 1718 that the mission was established. In 1720, the priest from the Zacatecan College, they requested a mission south of to be located south of the Valero mission, and after some opposition from the priest from Querétaro, a mission was established. Now, I don't have let's see here. These are some of the tribes that the National Park Service listed as being in South Texas. Now, this is the founding document of San Jose. Now, the founding document of San Jose says, up at the top it says año de 1720, which is 1720. It says founding. It says the founding of the pueblo and mission of San Jose and of San Miguel de Aguayo in the valley of San Antonio, of the Indians of the nations Pampua, Pastillas, and Surejames. It also states, the document states that three chiefs of the Pampua had come to the priests of the Zacatecans and requested a mission because they had seen the harvest of corn and so forth at Valero, or the Alamo missions, and they wanted to have a mission for themselves. So they established that mission in February 23rd, 1720. So that was the second mission on the San Antonio. By 1717, 6 missions had been established in East Texas. But the missions in East Texas weren't comparable to the missions here. The missions in East Texas were beset by all kinds of problems, by problems from the French and problems from the natives, and that the natives weren't that great as far as wanting to get into missions. Now, the 6 missions in East Texas were beset by all kinds of problems. So the authorities decided to move 3 of those missions to the San Antonio River area. The 3 missions were Conception Mission, Nuestra Señora de la Purísima Concepción. It was renamed Nuestra Señora de la Purísima Concepción de Acuña. And then another mission, San Jose de los Nazones, was moved and named San Juan Capistrano because there was already a San Jose here. San Francisco de los Neches from East Texas was renamed San Francisco de la Espada. Now, this is what they call auto de posesión, but it's a decree of title. This is the decree of title for the Indians at Conception. The Pajalat. But this document is interesting because it also shows that there was another mission there before. It was San Javier, I believe it was San Javier, San Francisco Javier de Najera. So that was a second mission. That's where Conception is now. Second. So this is a listing of the Native American population at the missions, and it starts out with quite a few individuals total at the end, but then along the 1770s, 1780s, the population was varied, and because it was difficult to get these folks into the missions. The priests had to go out in the wild and recruit people, and it was a dicey affair. Pardon? Okay, yeah, all right. Well, one more thing, one more scenario. 1788, there was an individual by the name of Carlos Martinez. He was a rancher here. This is the borrados, so forth. Carlos Martinez was a militia member. How much do I have time? Okay. Well, at any rate, there was a lot of the mission period was an epoch where there was a lot of epidemics. There was all kinds of things that mitigated against the missions. However, the people that were in the missions were mostly Espada and San Jose. They were they tended to stay around the missions. At San Jose, for example, we had several families. My family was from Espada, and I can't show this. This is 1772 census. Shows my fourth great grandmother, right there where the arrows are, from Espada. This is her house in 1845 or so at San Juan. She had received this house from the Mexican government, not the house, but the lot. And this is in the secularization. In the secularization, oh, this doesn't work. 1818 was the census in San Jose. This individual, Damaso de la Cruz, was awarded some property, but in this 1818 census, he says that these are the pure Indians at San Jose. These are the pure Indians, and they have never been insurrectionists. So the De La Cruz family, this is De La Cruz family up here. They had a reunion here on February 23rd, 2020, 300th anniversary of San Jose. Okay, let's see it, I guess. Okay. And the folks at Espada and San Jose missions, they were landowners. The descendants of those Indian people were landowners at Espada and San Jose, as far as I can tell, until the 20th century. Matter of fact, some of those people still own property today that are descendants of those folks. Now, they have the original bands have been changed. They have not gone away. They have not disappeared. They have just changed their appearances. So they're here in San Antonio. I would estimate that here in San Antonio there's maybe 100,000 folks that are descendants of those Native Americans. I know I am, and I know I have a lot of relatives here in San Antonio. The De La Cruz and Romero families also have a lot of descendants. So thank you very much.
And now for Rebecca Simmons, she'll be talking about the Franciscans and their purpose of coming here and what they hope to accomplish and how they did it.
Thank you. Good morning, and I want to thank Mickey Killiam for that wonderful chronology. And I'm not going to hopefully cover as much of that. I'm going to kind of go back because when I first saw the topic, which was, Texas Indians meet the Catholic Church, it kind of sounded like a social or something. They were going to meet. And in fact, that meeting was critical to San Antonio. It is no denying that the relationship of these two groups and their impact, right, on San Antonio and Texas for the past 300 years have shaped who we are. And I totally agree. The Native Americans that were part of that mission community, they're still here. They still worship, some of them, their descendants at the missions. Their descendants go to San Jose, they are at Espada. They're still here, and they're still having an impact on San Antonio. But I want to take us back because I want to talk about the perspective from the Catholic Church. Because we have here, they meet the Catholic Church. Well, who was the Catholic Church? What was the Catholic Church? I'm going to focus on the 18th century, and I'm going to focus on our San Antonio area. So your first question is, who was the Catholic Church? And the Catholic Church for us, and for the period I'm talking about, were the Franciscans, in a little partnership, of course, with Spain. And I'll explain that in a little bit. But we have to know who they were right? In order to know why they were here. And then once we know why they were here, then we get a better insight into what was being accomplished at the missions and what was the final result. So it's the who and why and what they accomplished that I want to go over just a bit with you today. So in Spanish America and in Mexico City, I don't know if you're familiar, but every year in December, approximately 2 million people gather, right, to venerate the Virgin of Guadalupe, right? And many of those people, of course, are the descendants of the indigenous people that the Spaniards found when they occupied, Mexico, right? And so you can see throughout Mexico and South America and into Texas and the Southwest, Spain had an oversized impact on these areas. How? How did that happen? How could they gain the control, or how could they basically conquer a people, right, over this period of time? And one of the ways and one of the things that happened is they developed a different attitude toward the indigenous than perhaps, and we'll contrast this, than our American colonists did in the Northeast. The Spaniards came in, and they were the Catholic country. They had just kicked the Muslims out of their country, right? And so they came in, and they were a Catholic country, and they viewed the indigenous as human beings with a soul. And there was a papal bull on that, and you think, well, of course they're human beings with a soul. Why was there any question? But there was, because if they didn't have a soul, then they could be killed, treated as, horrible slaves, which some of them were, by the way, through this whole system. But for the most part, they were treated as if they had a soul. And I'm going to now divert a little bit into the Franciscan mindset, because they were the primary missionaries, along with the Jesuits, in Spain and certainly up into Texas and into New Mexico, California. So the Franciscans, of course, were an order founded by St. Francis, and you may have seen him on bird baths or think of him as a blessing of the animals, right? But he was an ultimate radical for the time period he lived in 1209. He was completely radical. He believed in the absolute worth of every man and woman of equal dignity. That's a shocker. I don't think we've even gotten there today, right? But he preached that. And one of the things, it's kind of like St. Paul, he had a conversion story. And part of that conversion story was walking in Italy and came up upon some lepers, right? And the lepers at that time were shunned. I mean, for God's sakes, they were losing their noses. They were putrid. They smelled. They were living, barely subsiding, out in bushes and things like that. And you normally would avoid them like, frankly, we might do to avoid the homeless, right? You're going to move on around beside them. And what happened was he had a moment of looking and recognizing Christ within the leper, every bit as much as in his colleagues and everyone else. And this becomes important because his order in the 1200s regenerated the church at that time, because he went out to preach the gospel that we're all equal, right? And that we can have God's blessings and God within us. Get rid of the greed and the things that tear us apart. Poverty was important. You take a vow of poverty if you're a Franciscan and you own nothing. You rely on going and preaching the gospel and you get alms, and that's how you survive. And so they went out, and they went out not only in Italy, but of course, St. Francis went to the Muslims. He went to the Ottoman Empire. Others joined up, and the group grew and grew, and they went to Asia. And of course, they ended up in Spain. And I'm not here to give you a big lecture on this, but it helps you perhaps to understand the mindset of the Franciscans. One, they wanted to go out and preach the gospel to everyone in the world. But two, they also had the feeling that they had to go out into the world and spread the gospel, because only then would Jesus come for the second coming. So they considered it a gift that they had to give the people. And they considered it their duty to help the poor and help them. So despite what we think of the end result, their motives, right, in this were not so bad, right? The process was very burdensome, very difficult, and disastrous in some respects. But the motivation was not bad for the most part. And so, let me take you now in time. We've heard that the initial foray into Texas was in the 17th century, in the 1690s, and in fact, that's when Little Mission Espada was founded out in East Texas. But those failed, and part of the failure is they were 400 miles from the next settlement. They couldn't get supplies, they were starving. The Indian groups they met up with were not that interested. They had their own social hierarchical structure and just were not that interested. The missionaries there were starving, they were eating crows and rats, and eventually they had to retreat. But remember I mentioned Spain was a really big partner with the missionaries because they saw that they had value. They needed a buffer to keep the French. La Salle had sailed into Matagorda Bay, right? He created his little French colony there on Garcitas Creek. It failed. The Indians killed them all for the most part, although some were adopted into some of the tribes and that sort of thing. But they heard more French were coming, so the Spanish government said, okay, let's send some more missions out in 1715 to East Texas, and they did. And I want to bring up someone who plays a key role as a Franciscan here in San Antonio, and that's Padre Marhill. And I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but he was a Franciscan on steroids. And so he set up colleges, right? So he comes over from Spain in the 1600s with a boatload of other energized Franciscans, and he decides that his goal, they would give missionary services to parishes and things in Mexico, but he was going to go out and he was going to convert souls, and that's what he did. He created 2 colleges that we've heard of. This is a college, you can still see it in Querétaro, and this is a college in Zacatecas, and those were specially developed to teach Franciscans how to go out and convert people of different cultures. They studied languages, they created Cohiltecan sacrament books, they created, they'd been in this business, right, or this effort for over 100 years, right, in Spain, 200 years. And so they had worked on techniques on how to engage these Native Americans and other Native populations that they encountered. And so that's what these colleges were primarily for. It also taught them how to build structures and that sort of thing, and do that. But here is Father Marhill. Now, he refused to ride a horse. And so you see the trail. He starts out in Mexico and heads south. He ends up in the Yucatan, he ends up in El Salvador, Nicaragua, Chiapas, Costa Rica, comes back up to to Louisiana, and into Texas. All of this on foot, okay? So he travels thousands of miles. Now, in our day and age, with our sentiment, it's hard for us to look back at this time period. You know, my first thought is, why didn't they kill him? You know, he was in there with all these, indigenous groups. He must have been annoying. Apparently he had a cross that he would just, say everybody has to kneel to it. And some of the confusion was they would think that the cross was the actual God in the wood itself. So they had to work out languages and things like that. But I often thought, I don't know how he survived. But he did for many, many years. And he ends up in East Texas in 1715, but then the French start attacking. I think they attack one mission, and those all flee, right, at a certain point in time. Now, we've all heard that they came up to San Antonio, and the reason for that was they needed a supply chain, right? If they were going to get the East Mission's up and running, they needed a supply chain. Little did they suspect that actually the San Antonio River and the missions that ended up there would be their most successful endeavor in Texas. So they came in, they created Mission San Antonio de Valero, and Father Marhill, who was in East Texas, had to flee, and he came to Valero, and he was approached by a group, and he said, yes, you indigenous people, come into Mission Valero. And they said, no. We hate those guys. We want a new mission for ourselves. And so they provided one in 1720. San Jose is 300 years old. And by 2021, there were 200 Indians there. Now, part of the thing they did, of course, is they had a nomadic people who were being pressured by Apaches, later on Comanches, that were in danger there, had a difficult life from time to time on their subsistence hunting and gathering. They came into the mission, and they decided to come in to that mission. 1731 becomes a very important year because 3 of the missions that we have come in from East Texas at that time. There's again another fight. They decide to move in, and they come in and go along the river. Now, I don't know if many of you have been to California. It is highly unusual to have these missions so close to each other. Why? Why did they have that? Well, because San Antonio was just marauded constantly by the Apaches at first, and then the Comanches. They would steal horses, they would steal their children, right? Delivering children on the fly in a kind of warlike culture, sometimes you would adopt children from other tribes or take children so that you could increase your tribal numbers later on. And so that happened too. And so the walls you see around San Jose, those were defensive walls, right? There were about two Franciscans probably per mission. There was 3 soldiers, then ultimately 2, and then ultimately 1 soldier. And so if you had that kind of group, and then you were with 200 Native Americans, they had to be trained in self-defense. So we know from San Jose, they were trained in using guns, they were trained in arrows and everything else to defend the missions against these marauders. So let's talk a minute about, okay, so we know why they were here. They know that because of the French and becoming a supply chain, that's why they chose San Antonio. They had water. But what did they do there? And the main purpose of the Franciscans were to convert the Indian natives into good Catholics and to teach them skills, because they thought that was the way that they would better their lives. So they taught them agriculture, farming, husbandry for animals, weaving took place there. They had many cattle, they had many sheep, they wove their own clothes. They also, though, had many festivals. So they ran on cycles, the agricultural year, but they also celebrated all the liturgical festivals that occur, right, in the Catholic calendar. And that starts with Advent, right, and into Christmas. And they would have celebrations, and they made sure that they would have sweets at that time. And you must say, how does she know all this, right? And by trade, I was a lawyer, right? And so I always want to look at the evidence. And as a judge, what kind of evidence do we have? And I do want to bring this up. What we have now, of course, we have fabulous records of who was born, some of them what tribes. Those records of the baptisms, the weddings, the funerals, we have those. But what we also have is the Franciscans held those missions in trust for the people who lived there. And to do that, well, you had to make a record. So we've got inventories every year of all the stuff in the mission. People from these colleges came up to examine and see how the mission was doing. And the Franciscans wrote a lot back to their college to say, how they were feeling, how it was working, what was happening. And one of the most intriguing letters that goes back, and we don't know who did it, was a priest who is sending the care and keeping of Mission Concepcion to his successor. And from that, we learn a lot about their festivals. We learn a lot about their methods of teaching. We learn that they actually set up a political structure within each of those missions where the Indians would elect their mayor, their leaders. And so they would then be self-governed to some extent. So those mission heyday periods continue on for, 50 years. They have 200 to 300 Indians in each of those missions. They're converting them, they're teaching them skills. And then we come to secularization, which is the end result of what you want in each and every mission. It just took a longer time in San Antonio. And part of that, and I'm sorry if you're a descendant of the Canary Islanders, but part of that was the tension, because the Canary Islanders were always after their property, always after they wanted. Actually, they had a lawsuit to try and make them work for them during the time period. And the Franciscans had to hustle down to Mexico City to stop that from coming into play, because the work for them was merely just feeding them while they worked for them. And so anyway, but the secularization was then accomplished, and it was the giving of the property. All the land went out and was divided among the inhabitants. The tools, the animals, all went out to the inhabitants. The Franciscans said, "Thank you very much. I'm taking your records to what is now San Fernando Cathedral. You are becoming parish churches, and now we're leaving." And so they left. They went on to California or to other areas and that sort of thing. And I'm so sorry, I've kind of compacted 100 years of history into this amount of time, and I apologize for that. But I want to leave you with one thought. The three missions, they began their secularization in the late 1700s, right? And so by 1824, they were fully secularized. And you wonder, where are those? What happened to the mission Indians? Well, they became the farmers and the craftsmen and integrated into the city of San Antonio. They had houses in the area. Some of them that were skilled, became traveling craftsmen and that sort of thing. And so by, 5 years after, they have their land, they have their crops, they're living their life. And I want to contrast that with something that was going on in the United States. So you have what happened at the missions, and in 1830, the missions are secularized. They're kind of starting to fall into ruin. But also in 1830, you have Andrew Jackson and the Indian Relocation Act. There were 125,000 Native Americans in Tennessee, in Georgia, and North Carolina. They were taken off their land and forced to walk to the west of the Mississippi. That is how they dealt with their indigenous population. And during that time, the majority died on the way across. So when I look back, it must have been so difficult to just start a new culture in the missions, to change your life, to be ruled by a bell, to have to do crops and growing crops, and guarantee you some of them also left and came back and left and decided to just forego it. But they were integrated into society, and they were accepted and acculturated for the most part. They were welcomed by and loved certainly by the Franciscans. And thankfully, we were a frontier town, and the caste system of the Spanish, which is very strict, it fell apart. There weren't enough women, right? And so, you kind of forgave the fact. And you see in the records, the parish records, they start out as Indios, and one child is a mestizo, and then there's another child that comes along, they're Coyote, and then all of a sudden they're all Spanish, right, by the time they head to the funeral. So the caste system was quite fluid, right? And so, there was not the strict caste system that there was in Spain. But I often quander and often think about those two different systems of dealing with indigenous people, both incredibly difficult, right? Both incredibly difficult. But I am sure glad I'm in San Antonio, and I hope that my friends that are descendants, I'm glad that I get to see them here in San Antonio. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, I apologize for speeding through this.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that insight on the Franciscans. We are now going to ask both Mickey Killian and Rebecca to come up front and open it up for questions from the audience, if you have anything to ask either one of them. Let's see. I think it's on. Okay.
Hello, hello.
Oh, yeah. Yep, it's on.
Thank you both. Awesome. The Spanish had their way of dealing with the locals. The U.S. had their way of dealing with the locals. But the third way of dealing with the locals was the French way. Do you know anything of that background? I mean, trading kids for the winter, for one thing.
Do you want to talk here?
Well, here in San, is this on?
Yeah, it's on.
Here in San Antonio, one of the points I didn't bring up was the fact that in the late 1700s, 1780s, and so forth, the Apaches were such a, for one, they were such a scourge on the Spanish settlements that the Spanish entertained the idea of extermination. This is some of their commanders had entertained this idea. However, it never went that far. What they did do was they would capture the native children, and they would the militias that went out on punitive expeditions. They had extraordinary power. They had the power of life and death over prisoners and so forth. And the Spanish policy was to bring in the children, put them in the Spanish homes. And as a matter of fact, one of my ancestors was brought in to San Antonio, to the home of an individual by the name of Jose Maria Martinez. And she was raised and so forth, and she had children. So she's my ancestor. But the Spanish did capture many, many children. And if you go in the census records, and you can read Spanish, you'll see that there's a lot of people, a lot of individuals in the late 1700s that were Indian adopted children. So, no, they didn't kill everybody, like some other folks did, but they did capture the children and bring them in. So, and after a number of years, of course, the Apaches went away. So, that worked, I guess.
So the Spanish, of course, writing their letters, the friars, right, back to Spain, complained about the pesky French. And they were very mad at them because the men would go live and take Indian wives and have children and families. So they became integrated into the familial structure, right, of the Indians. Well, of course, the friars, with their vow of celibacy, none of that was going on. And so they really were, concerned about, about how integrated the French did become, particularly in East Texas. That was one of their complaints, for sure. And their other complaint actually was on the Spanish presidio and the soldiers going out and taking children as captives and then turning them over to the citizens of Bear. So.
Any other questions?
Thank you. Thank you both for your presentations. I have a question about secularization and how it went forward. And I'm thinking about, I know the story of as secularization occurs, the land around the missions generally goes to the families who are living there at the missions, some of whom at that time are Native American and some aren't. Some of the other lands, though, it seems like there are already other people leasing them. I'm thinking of the ranch lands. And I'm wondering if we know how much of those mission lands went to the Indians at the missions. Thank you.
Actually, we have pretty good, darn good records down at Bexar County because they have the land records, right? And there is a very interesting book written about those deed records and that sort of thing. So what happens later on in the time of secularization? There are a few Indians, but I hate to bore you to death with some details, but in 1773, Las Ideas, which had been the capital of Texas, and a number of the missions in each Texas closed. And we have a big influx in San Antonio of people coming from those missions that need a place to stay, they need land or whatever. In the meantime, the missions, there were not as many converts around, right? They were running out of that, and these people came. So they actually set up in the missions, took some of the Indian quarter spaces and stuff, and lived there after that, and they would help to harvest and that sort of thing. So to the extent that there were Indians, and there were fewer and fewer of them living at the missions at the time of secularization, actually Pedro Huizar was the sculptor of the rose window, was an incredible immigrant up from Mexico because he also was a surveyor, he was a sculptor, he was a man about town for sure. He came in and actually did the survey of, I think, Concepcion, the survey of that to give those lands away. Now, bear in mind, it's at Valero and at Concepcion. Well, who is staring right south looking for land? And that is the people of the villa, right? Because they'd kind of ran out. So they were on a lot of pressure. That's probably why San Antonio secularized first. But anyway, that was over explanation. But yes, we do know the Indian families that got that land for a lot of them. But we also know that over time, that didn't mean that they would keep it, right? They were Spanish citizens, which is a great thing because they got to go to court, right? They were recognized as Spanish citizens, and that gave them the benefit of being able to defend their property in court, but also gave them the benefit of becoming Mexican citizens and then U.S. citizens. And I would tell you, you know, when Native Americans became U.S. citizens in the United States? 1924. That's how long it took. So anyway, from a legal perspective, I really have looked at those deed records and have looked at that, and it's very interesting. There's a book about it, and I can give you the reference.
How are we on time? 3 minutes. Another question? Yes.
So your father, Mario, he died in San Salvador? Is that what happened?
Father Margil? So Father Margil, anyway, went back to Querétaro and back to Mexico City, and he died. He was carried there, but he died in Mexico. He died in Mexico. I mean, I think he was just worn out. But yeah. And it was only a few years after San Jose.
Was there a reason that he wouldn't thrive that he wanted?
He was the most humble man on earth, and he called himself and signed his letters nothingness itself, right? That's how he was only there to serve God. And it was, for all the Franciscans, it was too, they didn't want to ride a horse. They wanted poverty, so they walked. They might ride a donkey if something got bad, but I mean, Father Margil went out, and do you think he had a change of clothes? They actually have one of his robes down in the Franciscans do down in Zacatecas, and it's plant material and stuff all sewn into the robe. And then how many of you think that he would have worn a brown robe? How many think that he would wear? No! The Franciscans at that time all wore gray robes, right? So they were gray. They didn't develop the brown robe until the 1800s, so yes.
What was his first name?
Antonio. Antonio Margil de Jesus.
So that's the name, that elementary school on the west side is named after him.
You know, I'm not sure, but maybe so. I don't know, and I'm not sure, so. But there's a big statue to him in San Jose if you ever go in there, so.
I think that's time. Thank you all for coming.
Rhythm here, rhythm there, rhythm floating everywhere. Get with it, oh, get with it, red hot rhythm now. Sister's gone, daddy too, mama's in the kitchen singing poo-poo-be-doo. Get with it, oh, get with it, red hot rhythm now. It makes you shout, makes you sing, makes you want to go do things, makes you say, look what it's doing to me. Oh, first you're high, then you're low, then you start singing hidey-hidey-ho. Get with it, oh, get with it, red hot rhythm now. Oh, get with it, Mr. Man, get with it, Take it away, Mr. Leon. Play that guitar now. Your right foot in, mom, your left foot out. Well, you kind of baby, move your body about. Get with it, oh, get with it. Red hot rhythm now. Some like the stomp, some like the hop. But give me the shimmy or the eagle rock. Get with it, oh, get with it. Red hot rhythm now. It gives you pep, makes you get every day those blues away. Try it once and here's what you will say. Oh, when your nights are long, you're feeling blue. Put on your spats and your low-cut shoes. Get with it, oh, get with it. Red hot rhythm now. Oh, babe, oh, Leon.
Oh, babe, what can the matter be? Oh, babe, something's a bothering me. How come I can't come knocking around your door?
Yeah.
Oh, babe, how come you let me down? Oh, babe, why can't I hang around? Since when ain't I your fair-haired boy no more?
Yeah.
Every night I take you out, you're the one to frown and pout. Someday you'll make me shout, whoa, 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 whoa. Whoa, babe, how do you get that way? Whoa, babe, someday you're gonna pay. When I leave you, I'll darken your door no more.
Brother Elton Shamble. All kind of fooling around on that old standard guitar.
Oh, babe, what can the matter be? Oh, babe, something's bothering me. How come I can't come knocking around your door?
Well?
Oh, babe, how come you let me down? Oh, babe, why can't I hang around? Since when ain't I your fair-haired boy no more?
You don't come
Every
knocking
night I
round my
take you
door,
out,
Reese.
you're the one to frown and pout.
Yeah.
Someday you'll make me shout, woods, beep, blah, you whoa, yo, ho, babe. How do you get that way? Oh, babe, someday you're gonna pay. When I leave you, I'll darken your door. my blue-eyed Sally. She lives away down on Shinbone Alley. The number on the gate, the number on the door, and the next house over is a grocery store. Stay all night, stay a little longer, dance all night, dance a little longer. Pull off the coat, throw it in the corner. Don't see why you don't stay a little longer. You can't go home if you're going by the mill, 'cause the bridge is washed out at the bottom of the hill. The big creek's up and the big creek's level. I plow my corn with the double shovel. Stay all night, stay a little longer, dance all night, dance a little longer. Pull off the coat, throw it in the corner. Don't see why you don't stay a little longer. Sitting in the window, singing to my love, and the slop bucket fell from the window above. The mule and the grasshopper eating ice cream, and the mule got sick and I laid him on a bean. Stay all night, stay a little longer, dance all night, dance a little longer. Pull off the coat, throw it in the corner, and don't see why you don't stay a little longer. Grab your gal and pat her on the head. If she can't eat biscuits, feed her cornbread. The girls on the big creek about half grown. Jump on a man like a dog on a bone. Stay all night, stay a little longer. Dance all night, dance a little longer. Pull off the coat, throw it in the corner. Don't see why you don't stay a little longer.
Oh, here's that fat boy again. With them old Bernard blues this time. In fact, that's Junior Bernard playing it. I'll get it low, Junior, or else ride it high.
Started acting and then.
Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to Section 5, Stranger in a Strange Land, the Saga of Cabeza de Vaca. Brandon Seal, who will be giving our presentation, was born in Abilene and raised in San Antonio. He currently serves as a president of Howard Energy Mexico, director of the Texas Lyceum, and honorary commander of the Inter-American Air Forces Academy. With degrees in philosophy, law, and business, he writes and records stories about Texas-Mexico borderland and publishes a podcast, and I invite you to listen to them because they're fascinating, from his new history of Old Texas. And Brandon is a man of many talents, and he's going to be talking about the first European to encounter our native Texans and to live and write about it. And as an archaeologist, that saga is so important in terms of a story that we're trying to write through the material culture. I'm really excited about hearing this because I know Brandon has done a lot of work on this. He's a man of many talents, and it is my pleasure to introduce Brandon Seal.
Well, good morning, and thank you again for having me here. And the joke that Professor Porter was making before I started too is the last time I tried to talk about this, it took me about 12 hours. Are you getting some echo here? this good? It took about 12 hours in podcast form, so I'm going to condense it here into 35 or 40 minutes. And in fact, I'm going to assume, if you're here at a Texas History Conference, that you have some passing familiarity with Cabeza de Vaca and his journey. So I'm going to be able to just hit the highlights, because I really want to get to a moment about 6 or 7 years into his journey that I think is a unique moment, a unique insight into the worldview of the Native Americans that he's living amongst. Because his account still is an account from a European's perspective. But what I'm actually going to argue is we can actually see some of the Native Americans' worldviews and mythologies kind of impressed upon his account. So, high level, Cabeza de Vaca, born in 1488 to a family of middling nobility back in Castile. He's born in Jerez de la Frontera. And so both the year that he's born and the place that he's born are kind of watershed critical moments. So obviously 1488 is just a few years before 1492, which is both the ultimate, the end of the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula by the Catholic monarchs of Castile over the Muslim Emirate of Granada. But it's also, of course, the opening of the New World. And Jerez de la Frontera, as its name suggests, in Spanish it means Jerez of the border. It sat for 200 years on the border of this conflict with the Muslim kingdoms, but then also too with the opening of the New World, all of this traffic, actually there was a royal monopoly that gets established in Seville, which is right next to Jerez de la Frontera. So all of the trade that's going on through the New World is actually coming through this area too. So all around Cabeza de Vaca for his youth are these stories of conquest and of exploration of the New World. His parents die when he's young, but he's still brought up in a pretty typical upbringing for a man of his class. He's attached to a powerful family in Seville, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, and he fights in the King's Wars in Italy. He puts down some rebellions back in Castile, and by 1522 he's actually married pretty well for himself. But also by 1522, all of the wealth of the New World, all of the wealth of the Indies has started to flood back into Seville. So recall, 1519 is the Cortes lands in Mexico, 1521 Tenochtitlan falls, and it's just this torrent of wealth. All of a sudden, men of modest means but immodest ambitions are being up-jumped in class. Cortes actually was pretty close in age to Cabeza de Vaca, and he was actually of a slightly lower rung of nobility, and he's on his way to being named a duke, raised up to the dignity of a duke. And so anyway, this captures the imaginations of all the young men and some young women too in Castile at this time. And so in 1526, Cabeza de Vaca gets his chance. In 1526, he is appointed the royal treasurer on the Pánfilo de Narváez expedition. Pánfilo Narváez was a rival of Cortes's, who goes back to Spain, or goes back to Castile. We should be careful here. Spain doesn't actually exist for several hundred more years, technically speaking. But goes back and he gets the commission for effectively North America. He gets the commission from the king to go settle the territory they call La Florida, the Florida, which actually at this time extends pretty much the entire northern rim of the Gulf of Mexico. So Cabeza de Vaca, and he's the royal treasurer, so he's kind of the king's personal appointee on what is otherwise kind of a private expedition. Narváez and other investors are what fund this. And very famously, of course, the Narváez expedition does not go very well. So they depart Spain, or they depart the Iberian Peninsula in 1527. At their first port of call in the Caribbean at Santo Domingo, 140 of the 600 men jump ship. They bail and kind of go find other jobs in the boomtown environment of the Caribbean. About 60 more of the men die from a hurricane that actually hits the fleet off the coast of Cuba, destroys 2 ships and 60 of the men. And then actually when they do try and sail from Cuba, they're trying to sail over to Pánuco, which is basically modern-day Tampico. But they get tossed and turned in this storm and for 50 days and nights. And by the time they finally sight land on April 10th, 1528, they've actually sighted the western coast of Florida. They still think that it's the eastern coast of Mexico, however. They're terribly disoriented, and they really won't figure this out for years. I mean, it scrambles them entirely, and it almost makes this, it feels like the opening of some kind of, hokey, magical, realistic movie or something like that, that they're tossed and turned through the storm and spit out onto the shore. Well, again, it doesn't go much better for them on land either. So once they're on land in Florida, they spend, there's 300 men is all that's left to kind of disembark, and only about half of the horses they had brought along. They spend about 3 months chasing rumors of corn and gold throughout Florida, throughout the inland part of Florida. They lose another 60 men along the way too, to disease and to hostile natives who aren't glad to see them there because their only previous encounters with Spaniards had been slaving expeditions. So by September of 1528, there's only about 240 of these men left. They make their way back to the shoreline, and they realize that they've lost contact with their ships. They have no way to reestablish contact with their supply chain effectively too, because that was their real advantage, was their logistical and supply chain advantage, and that's cut off from them. But again, these are the go-ahead men of their age. They're si se puede kind of guys. They don't give up. They take all the iron they can, all the armor, the swords. They hammer them into nails. They fell trees. They fashion these rafts. So they spend 2 months basically rigging up these rafts. And raft is a generous use of the term, because these crafts that they create ultimately, they're not watertight at all. The only reason they float is because of the buoyancy of the logs. So these rafts are like 45 feet long, maybe 15 feet wide. There's about 50 men to a raft. They make 5 rafts for the 240 or so survivors that are left, which basically, if you do the math, gives every person about as much room as a yoga mat. They get on there, these things they talk about, they're barely floating above the water line. They're basically a hand length above the water line as they're floating. And so November 1528, they trust their fates to the Gulf of Mexico, and they start floating along. Well, again, their luck follows them into the Gulf as well. So after about a week, they're out of fresh water, they're out of food, they're out of options. All along the shoreline, they can see smoke signals going up from as these native tribes are kind of warning their brethren that, hey, there's bad news coming, and so what that means is all the natives pull back from the coast. So there's no one even for these expeditionaries to trade with or to raid for that matter either. Well, I take that back. There is one tribe that actually comes out to greet them, that receives them and kind of brings them in very generously, and then it turns out to be a trap. They kind of turn on them and send them fleeing back into their rafts. And so, this goes on for about 5 weeks. And by the end of these 5 weeks, these guys are they're sacks of bones. I mean, that's literally, you could describe it. You could count the bones on their bodies. And it's almost, what hits them next is almost like a Greek Sisyphean torture or something like this. So 5 weeks, they have no fresh water. They're floating along the coast. And then suddenly someone realizes that the water in front of them, the water that they're floating through along the Gulf here, is fresh water. And they test it, and they can't believe it. And then they put down a sounding line and try and find bottom. And suddenly, whereas before they had kind of stayed the whole time in about 6 feet of water, just because it allowed them to, almost like a gondola, kind of keep pushing along and keep control of their shoddy crafts, they realize that they can't find bottom. They drop 180 feet of sounding line, and they can't find bottom. Well, they're coming across the mouth of the Mississippi River right here. So suddenly, they have more fresh water than they could ever use. And in fact, some of the guys drink so much that they're bloated and they can't even function. But it's also the current. The current of the Mississippi River, they realize, is so powerful. They spend 2 days and nights paddling against this current, trying to fight against it, but to no avail. So by the 3rd day, they wake up in the morning and they're out of sight of land. They're out of sight of each other. These 5 rafts have been scattered to the winds, basically. So by the 4th night, they've essentially almost kind of given up on everything. They talk about, Cabeza de Vaca talks about on his raft, there was only 2 men that were left conscious by the time they went to sleep on the 4th night. Again, they haven't eaten in weeks. They haven't had fresh water. Well, they had fresh water, but they got too much of it, the day before. And so they're woken, however, on the morning after the 5th night of this, or the 5th day of this, by the sound of breakers in the distance. And then suddenly they're thrust onto the shoreline of modern-day Galveston Island. And here, one of my photos here. And here, they, all they can do at this point is crawl. There's only a few men that can actually even walk at this point, and so they kind of crawl onto the shoreline. They make a half-hearted attempt to push their vessel, their raft, back out into the surf, but the waves just send it crashing back down, and actually in the process of this, they lose what's left of their clothes. They had taken their clothes off to try and keep them dry, but so then when the raft finally gets overturned, they lose all their clothes too. So now they're literally, naked, starving, all of their weapons are gone too, so all they can do is kind of sit and huddle on the shoreline. It's sometime, December or something like this in 1528. It's cold. And then, para el colmo de los males, just to put the icing on the cake, they look up on the dunes and 100 natives show up there. And they're huge. They recall them, they say they looked like giants. And again, there's some historical record of this too, that the natives of the Texas coast actually were quite tall. But they have, long bows that are as long as they are. And they don't know what can happen next. And something changes here at this moment in the story, or maybe something changes in Cabeza de Vaca. And there's kind of even a debate amongst the men here on the shore. I mean, should they fight these guys? Should they try and run? Like, what should they try and do? And it's Cabeza de Vaca, at least according to his own account, although he co-writes his account actually with 2 of his other surviving companions, so there's presumably, it's not totally fiction. But so Cabeza de Vaca, who is this great war hero from Italy, who's raised on these great stories of romantic combat Amadis of Gaul and stuff like this, he takes a different approach. He realizes his nakedness, he realizes his vulnerability, and he just kind of leads with it. He goes up to the natives standing there. He walks up to them. The Cabocles is the tribe, as they call themselves, the Cabocles. He goes up to them and through hand signs tries to communicate what has kind of happened to them. I mean, it was evident that something bad had happened to them, but he still tries to kind of communicate this with hand signs, and it works. He's able to communicate. And he knows it works because they start crying. The natives actually start crying when they understand what he's telling them and what's going on, which is a remarkable reaction too, because I mean, these guys still are kind of interlopers on an island of pretty limited resources, but it's just, it elicits just this emotional response. And it kind of reinforces for Cabeza de Vaca a different strategy. The strategy that he's going to use, he and his other companions are going to use to survive the next 8 years of their stay in North America, because we're really only at the beginning here. This is 1528, and he's going to be there till 1536. And so, but I'm going to fly through some of these next years because, like I said, I really want to get to this moment further along in the story. And so, of the original 300 expeditionaries who landed in Florida, there's only going to be 4 really that survive even the first few years. You've got Cabeza de Vaca, you've got Andrés Dorantes, and you've got Alonso Castillo, and you've got Esteban, who is described as quote-unquote a black Arab. He's a black man. We don't know quite his lineage, but there's various references to him being from somewhere from northern Africa, and he actually he came to the New World as Andrés Dorantes' slave, one of the other survivors. So these 4 basically, for the next 6 years, are going to survive essentially almost by handing themselves over to a form of slavery. I mean, they describe it as slavery. Slavery is a bit strong. I mean, they're working for room and board in a world of very limited resources. I mean, they're sharing the starvation of their keepers or of their masters. And actually the highlight, but they're doing the work. Unfortunately, they're kind of useless, even as slaves in the New World, at least initially. They don't know how to forage. They don't know how to hunt in this landscape. They don't know what to look for. And so they're reduced, and this is Cabeza de Vaca's language, they're pushed into doing, essentially women's work around the camp. They're having to scrape hides and to do those kind of things. And, and another version of women's work, too, and this is actually a highlight for Cabeza de Vaca of these years, he becomes a bit of a merchant. He becomes a trader, kind of going back and forth amongst some of the inland tribes and the coastal tribes, hawking various wares, red ochre and seashells and stuff like this. But again, too, in the cultures of those times, men didn't do that. Men were viewed as hostile. And there's a great book by Juliana Barr, that talks about this idea of that peace comes in the form of a woman. That in these early Texas tribes, women were often the bearers of peace and the bearers of trade and those kind of things, too. But again, it's a role that Cabeza de Vaca falls into. And so, one of the things that Cabeza de Vaca observes very early on, and I think he may have observed this in particular as a trader, if he's trading some of these goods, was the unique role that medicine men, that shamans played in these cultures. So these medicine men, Cabeza de Vaca and his companions observed, they didn't have to work. They were allowed to take multiple wives instead of a single wife. When they died, they were burned instead of buried. And importantly, too, of course, being a medicine man, you don't just get to be a medicine man. You have to be able to cure people, to be able to heal people. And what they observe, too, is that when they perform a successful cure, they're paid quite handsomely by their patients. I mean, the going rate for a cure is the person basically gives the doctor or gives the medicine man everything they own, which feels like it invites a joke to that's about what it costs today to get healed for most things too, for most doctors. But I think the idea is you've given that person back their life, and so everything you have it becomes the property of the medicine man at that point. And so, and there's also something about Cabeza de Vaca and Dorantes and Castillo and Esteban that seems to make some of the natives want to believe that they might be medicine men. And that's not too hard to imagine. They just looked so different. I mean, you've got 3 pale-skinned bearded guys, 1 very dark-skinned, also bearded guy. They just looked, Native Americans hadn't seen anything like these guys before. And so very early on Galveston Island, there's actually a first instance of where the natives try to get the expeditionaries to be faith healers. So again, this part of the tragedy of this exchange here, when Cabeza de Vaca and his raft land on the island and the natives take them in and care for them and feed them, unfortunately there's an exchange of diseases. And actually it kills off, in this case, it actually kills off more of the old worlders than it does the new worlders. It kills off something like 80% of the expeditionaries and about 50% of the natives. And again, it's probably because the expeditionaries were in such a weakened state already. But this disease is running rampant through the camp. And the Cabocles, the locals, basically say to Cabeza de Vaca, all right, you guys brought this problem, you need to fix it. Here's some stones. We want you to rub these stones, pass these warm stones over the sick people. Here's some sharper knives. We want you to make some incisions, draw blood effectively from some of these other people, and say the right words and fix them. And at first, the expeditionaries think they're kidding. They start laughing. They start saying, like, yeah, that's not how healing works. And they say, like, you heal them or you die. Like it was a very simple proposition at that point. And so they take it seriously. And they perform this very beautiful syncretic ceremony of, they wait till sundown, till the sun is going down. They basically kind of perform like a mass. They repeat some Pater Nosters and some Ave Marias. They pass the warm stones over the victims. They incise them a little bit with the knives, and they finish with a big sign of the cross. And it worked. And it healed them. And the expeditionaries are as surprised by this as anyone. And they don't quite know what to do with it. They don't quite know what to make of this. They take this power very, very seriously. And it kind of scares them, frankly. They kind of tuck it away, and they won't pull it out again for several more years. And partly because, too, they just become consumed then at just trying the day-to-day facts of trying to stay alive and find enough to eat. But by the summer of 1834, they'd had enough. They'd lived this meager existence. They'd made their way a little bit down the coast from Galveston. By this time, they're somewhere probably in South Texas, maybe around Brooks County, Hebronville, kind of something in that area. And again, it's still pretty hand to mouth. And so what they decide in the summer of 1534 is they're going to wait for the big prickly pear harvest, the big prickly, which is kind of the only time of real bounty in that region during the year, which, if you know anything about it, is also in the middle of summer, middle of August. I mean, just the hottest part of the year. But they were going to do that because they could take this bounty, they could dry some of the prickly pears, and at least they could move a little bit. They could have some mobile provisions that they could take with them. And so they decide September 1534, they're going to make their way south. They still have some notion in their head that if they go south far enough, they'll reconnect with New Spain, with Cortez's settlement down there. They're going to do that or they're going to die trying. And so they kind of sneak away from their keepers. They sneak away from the tribes that had been keeping them. And they come upon the first new tribe, where they're kind of unknowns. And historically they had gone up to these tribes and essentially offered themselves over as beggars or as servants or as slaves or whatever, but they tried a different strategy in this case. And there's even a suggestion that it may have been Esteban who came up with this idea. They always sent Esteban ahead first because he was the most distinctive looking, but also because Esteban seemed to have a real aptitude for languages and for being able to find ways to communicate. So they send him ahead first, and he seems to tell this village, this community, that 4 great medicine men are coming. Not 4 beggars, 4 great medicine men are coming. So he's changed the expectation to begin with, and it kind of works. When they show up, they certainly look like nothing else this tribe has ever seen before. They show up, and the tribe is thrilled. I mean, it's like celebrities are in town. It's a rock band has showed up or something, or at least that's what they've been told. Now, again, of course, the challenge is you can't just say you're a medicine man. You have to actually be able to heal, and so they don't waste any time. The tribesmen pull up, 5 of their companions who are sick, and they bring them before these 4 new self-proclaimed medicine men. And again, same deal. They kind of fall back on this ritual that they had performed a few years before. They take some warm stones. They take the things that they've observed over the last 6 years, that they've seen the native shaman, the native medicine men doing. They copy that and they blend it, again at sunset, at that liminal hour, and they blend it with their own kind of liturgy and with their own mass. And they go through it, and it's many hours long. This isn't like an abracadabra kind of thing. I mean, this is something where they conduct a full ceremony, because part of what seems to be going on too is that they believe that God has to be present to make these cures work, and they believe that God has to want them to heal, and they believe that they have to deserve, God's power to move through them. And in fact, at first, when they hesitate to cure, one of the reasons they say that their reluctance comes from is because they were afraid that their sins might interfere with their ability to cure. Like, they're taking this very, very seriously, and they feel like they need to do kind of this purification before they can do it. But once again, they do this incredible ceremony, and the five natives are healed. Again, it works. And again, the afflictions are unclear. It's always a little unclear what exactly the afflictions is, because again, the quantity of people that they're encountering that apparently are needing some kind of cure, I think scholars have written about all kind of different theories. Is it just psychosomatic, or is it typhus? Like, do they have some kind of European disease, or is it just like psychological even? I don't know. It's a little unclear. We can't quite figure out what it is. But if nothing else, the performance of it seems to do something, and it seems to create this effect. And it's certainly Cabeza de Vaca and his companions' belief that this is what's allowing them to survive and to keep moving at this point too. Because word starts to spread. Word starts to spread that these guys are here somewhere, and by now they're not quite to the Rio Grande maybe, they're somewhere, Starr County, Texas, something like this, that there's these 4 incredible medicine men, and people start coming from all around. And what helps with this too is that Cabeza de Vaca and his companions, there's another part to their strategy which is a little bit unique. When they get paid by their patients for their cures, they actually turn around and give it all back away to the people around them, which is remarkable for a couple points too. For one, in their first cure, one of the gifts they get is dried venison, and they don't even know what it is because they haven't seen protein in so long. At first, they don't know what it is. So these guys who have been starving and have been living in such scarcity for so long that they're able to then turn around and, I would become a hoarder. You know what I mean? If I hadn't eaten good in 6 years, I don't know that I would have that magnanimity of spirit to be able to turn around. But again, it creates almost like a bit of a pyramid. I don't want to say scheme, but it creates a strong incentive for people to keep supporting them and to keep coming to them, and soon they have a group of followers, and it grows. First it's in the dozens, and then it's in the hundreds, and then it's in the thousands. Literally at one point they say they have thousands of people following them. They're gathered around them, and there's some credibility to this. By the time they actually get back to New Spain, the Spanish accounts talk about how the Castilian accounts talk about how there's 600 natives behind them at that point. So there seems to be some credibility to this, but I got sidetracked a little bit there. Suddenly you have these 4 expeditionaries who for 6 years had been stuck stuck in South Texas, unable to move at any appreciable speed, and suddenly they're the most sought after medicine men on the continent. And the speed of things starts to pick up, like we talked about, building their entourage and starting to move. Now they're able to move, much more quickly through the countryside. But all of this fame and all of this new kind of material wealth, it still can't protect Cabeza de Vaca from the more dangerous elements of the Texas landscape. And so one night or one evening when he's out foraging or out kind of on his own, he's separated from his band, and as the sun starts to go down, he can't find them. And he kind of panics. Obviously being alone is a terrible thing in South Texas, in the South Texas wilderness, and he doesn't know what to do. So he kind of, even as after night falls, he's still wandering around, still trying to find traces of these companions. And he also points out to us again here that he's, at this moment, it's strange that he recalls this for us, just to set the scene, that he's still naked as the day I was born. Desnudo como nací, naked as the day I was born. But then in the distance, he sees like a glow. He sees a faint glow. And so he starts going toward it. It kind of looks like a campfire or something, but he's very cautious. He doesn't know whose it is. He starts trying to listen for voices. But as he gets closer, he realizes there's no voices around it. There's no people around it. And he walks up to it, and it's a tree that's on fire. It's a hand of God burning bush in the middle of the South Texas Monte. And so he walks up to it. He by the way, doesn't emphasize for us the obvious biblical parallel. He just kind of keeps describing it matter-of-factly. He goes up to it. He's able to pull off some of the flaming, the burning branches and takes them with him. And that night he's able to dig a little hole for himself, and he makes 4 little fires around him, like in the shape of a cross, one on all sides. He pulls some grass in over himself kind of as a blanket. And for the next 5 days and nights, this is his routine. He'll walk around, he'll keep these embers lit. At night, he'll dig his little hole and he'll make his fires around himself again. But he still can't find his band, but he keeps doing this. And this is what allows him to survive. But then on the 5th night, as he's sleeping, one of the fires throws a spark. It throws a spark and it catches the grass that he puts on top of himself on fire. And he doesn't wake up until like his hair is on fire and he's partly burned, and he comes kind of leaping out of the hole, and he's having to pat himself to put this fire out, and he barely survives it. And it's memorable for him, and he says it'll leave him scarred even for years later. But he finds his band the next day. He finds his 3 companions, and he's reunited with them. And he, as he tells the story of what happened, I think the parallel to Moses is obviously, self-evident. I think his 3 companions would have gotten the burning bush parallel immediately. But what I think is even more interesting, and I want to dive deep on right here, is what he had actually gone through. What his Native American listeners, I think, would have heard was him recounting the quintessential Native American underworld rebirth story, a story that the people of the Coahuiltecan Plains of northern Mexico and South Texas had actually been telling for thousands of years. How do I know this, or on what basis am I making this claim? So at a couple points in my podcast, I've incorrectly lamented the fact that we don't really have primary accounts from the Native Americans, at least pre-contact primary accounts of their lives. But that's not strictly true, and there's really no better place to talk about this than here at the Witte, which is to talk about the rock art panels. Nestled in the canyons of the Lower Pecos River are hundreds of these rock art panels, which again, you can go right next door, upstairs actually, and kind of see these. And I'll talk, this is from White Shaman, which is one that's featured upstairs too, and I'll talk about this a little bit. But these things, they're in some cases 150 feet long, and 15 feet high. They're enormous compositions of real complexity. And at first glance, I think when you first see them, it's hard to know what to make of them, and it almost looks, like is it just scribblings or the peyote hallucinations of Stone Age artists or something like that. But there's a lot more to it, and the clues are in the compositional complexity. For one, when you go and actually analyze the pigments that they use, they're using items and resources that are scarce. The binder for their paint is deer fat, and we just talked about how rare deer fat and and protein and stuff like that was in these people's diets. These people are sacrificing resources from their diet to be able to create these paints. Also, an interesting fact I find is that the paints are almost always applied in the same order, the different colors. And I can't remember the order now, but they're all red, yellow, black, and white, and they're all applied in the same order in almost every composition. They've gone back and been able to analyze this, which means that if you know the order that those are applied and you're used to seeing them that way and you're a contemporary, you can sit down and look at those and you can almost see them in 3D. You know that the red was on the scene first, and then the yellow shows up, and then the black, and then the white. So they're almost they're movies. They're effectively, Stone Age movies, relating events that are important enough to the people of this region that they're sacrificing their nutritional resources to be able to record them. So let's talk about a few of the themes that are some of the most consistent in these. And again, the reason this is relevant too is this is exactly the region that Cabeza de Vaca is going through about this time in his narrative. He's crossing the Rio Grande. He crosses the Rio Grande and kind of then tracks up through Nuevo León, up into Coahuila, and then somewhere around Coahuila too, crosses back over in the Big Bend region. And so right in the region of where most of this rock art is found. So one of the main themes that we see in this rock art is crenellated arches is the term. I'm using Carolyn Boyd's terminologies from some of her work on this stuff. The crenellated arch, which you can see right there, it's prominent in a bunch of these works, and it's interesting because it often almost looks like it's imposed on top of the work. If you don't know how to contextualize it, it looks like it's almost kind of thrown in there or dissecting the work or something like this. But the suggestion seems to be of this crenellated arch that it's suggestive of the layered nature of the worldview that these natives seem to have in their head. This idea of a subterranean, a superficial, and a spiritual world. And the arch seems to kind of represent that boundary, which, by the way, too, is also why these are frequently found in caves and in rock shelters. Those are also the kind of those archetypal liminal spaces, between the subterranean and the surface. Okay, another theme that you're going to see a lot is these skeletonized shamans, like this guy right here. They're depicted often as almost without any meat on their bones, and the idea seems to be that they're figures that have learned how to see themselves through to their core. They're figures that have learned how to see themselves, through to their own nakedness, as it were. And you'll often see them here too, kind of bursting through these boundary layers, and they're able to cross between the layered worldview, between the subterranean and the superficial, between the spiritual and the material. And often too, by the way, they're often depicted holding kind of like the larger black figure there, depicted with like a flaming head, or like with torches in each hand, or flaming torches in each hand. All right, who does that sound like? So go back to the story I just told you about Cabeza de Vaca, sleeping in his hole and bursting out of that hole with his hair on fire, carrying his firebrands around the countryside. Oh, and I forgot to mention this too. So the number 5 is sacred in this region's tradition. There's actually even there's an Aztec word, or a Nahuatl word for their god of fire, Nayatecuhtli. And the idea, Nayatecuhtli refers to the group of 4, where the 5th component is the group itself. Anyway, just the idea being that 5 is some sacred number. Well, remember, 5 nights was how many nights Cabeza de Vaca was out there. Look at his group. He is part of a group of 4. He and his companions are a group of 4 traveling as a unit, making that 5th group. So it's what I'm starting to feel, or what I'm starting to hear here, it's almost, if you're a Native American listener to this, and if this interpretation of some of this imagery is correct, when Cabeza de Vaca comes back from his misadventure out there in the monte, it's It's almost like he's walked out of the rock art panels, and into real life, is what I think it would have sounded like. And I can keep going too. So here's kind of a third theme that shows up through a lot through these. It's serpents, the theme of serpents. Serpents play a critical role here. And this is interesting too for me. In Cabeza de Vaca's account, right after he tells the story of being lost in the monte and returning to his tribe, he makes an interesting analogy. He talks about how they suffered greatly from kind of the heat and the sun and the work and the prickly thorns that they had to forage through in the South Texas brush country. And he refers to it. He says that they shed their skin twice a year like snakes, which is an interesting image. And then he also goes on to say too, he talks about how the thorns, how painful they were, and the only thing that bore him through this was thinking of how Jesus' pain must have been so much greater with his crown of thorns and on the cross. And it's an interesting juxtaposition because you've got the serpent, it's immediately recalling the story of the Garden of Eden and this image of original sin juxtaposed immediately not only with the image of Jesus as the redeemer of original sin, but also with Jesus at the moment of the redemption, on the cross with the crown of thorns and things like that. Well, let me take it here too to the Native American tradition, going back to the serpents and the significance of serpents here. So I'm going to quote some of these. This is from Carolyn Boyd's work here. But okay, so and these are all tribes. These are all Uto-Aztecan speaking tribes, and I'll come back to that in a second. But the Yaquis, these are relatives, distant relatives of the Aztecs. The Yaquis quote: "Entrance and exit to the supernatural world must be made through the mouth of a giant serpent." Here's the Hopis. "The serpent serves as the communicator between the earthly world and the world below. The Aztecs often depicted the surface of the earth itself as a serpent, and you can even picture this sometimes in your head, or if you've been to some of their temples, you can sometimes you'll have a large serpent forming like the base of the foundation and stuff like this. And the Huichols, who are still active today, the Huichols still today conceive of the world itself as surrounded by a sea-like serpent with two heads through which the sun must pass each day. In precisely the way the snake sheds its skin, it is constantly reborn. In the same way as the medicine man who passes from the spirit world to the material world is reborn. In the same way as the central figure of the expeditionary's faith is kind of what I argue here as well. So what Cabeza de Vaca is doing is he's using language and imagery from both the Christian and Native American traditions. He's kind of showing off his fluency in both of these traditions, but what it gives us is an insight into his gospel, essentially, or into his ministry, what he's saying and preaching to these Native Americans. But this kind of helps validate why it would have been working, when we kind of see similar imagery validated in some of their primary sources in this rock art. All right, so here's another cool detail, too, that I'll throw out. Cabeza de Vaca only gives us two words from Native American grammars, actually two Native American words, which is also interesting because they encountered all these tribes and they clearly found ways to communicate, but he only preserves two words for us. One of them is araka, which means come here, which I can't make anything of. But the second one is interesting. From around this time, he tells us that their word for dog is sho, X-O, sho. And if you watch Mexican League soccer, like the Tijuana soccer team is the Xolos. The word in Nahuatl for dog is xolo, just like xolotl, which is their native dog deity and traditional guide to the underworld. And so, what I can't help but wonder is this, were Cabeza de Vaca's followers, native followers, walking around calling him Xo? Is he their kind of native leader through the monte, through this kind of underworld journey that he's already kind of told us? We're getting a little out there, but for what it's worth, I have talked about this with Carolyn Boyd, and she thinks there's something to it. I don't think it's totally crazy. And again, kind of interestingly as well, Xolotl also famously is a famous twin in Aztec mythology, and his name even has the context of like a double or a twin, which is a nice transition into this incredible story from Cabeza de Vaca's account of what's very obviously seems to be a twin. And so this is an interesting story too, because it takes up 3 or 4 pages of a 120-page narrative, and it totally disrupts the chronology that Cabeza de Vaca is telling. And again, it's the only real extended story from Native American mythology or worldview that he really gives us. So why? Why does he decide to preserve this story? And so let me just go ahead and read through it, and then we can count the ways that it sounds familiar. So from the natives' account, according to Cabeza de Vaca, it all started 15 or 16 years ago. They told us that a man had gone about in that land whom they called malacosa, bad thing in English, short-haired with a beard, though his face they could never clearly make out. Just before he arrived at someone's lodge, the occupant's hair would stand on end and they would tremble, and then suddenly malacosa would appear in the doorway holding burning sticks. He would enter their lodge and take whatever he wanted from them. Then he would make 3 cuts into their sides with a very sharp rock. Then he would stick his hand into the incisions and remove their intestines, and he would cut off several inches. And the part that he cut off, he would throw in the fire. Then he would make 3 cuts into their arms. A short while later, he would reset the arm. They said that many times when they were dancing in their religious ceremonies, he would appear among them, sometimes dressed as a woman, sometimes as a man. And that when he wanted to, he could pick up an entire lodge and lift it in the air and bring it crashing down. They also said that many times they gave him food to eat, but that he never ate. And that when they asked where he came from and where he had his home, he pointed to a hole in the ground and said that his home was down below. So let me count all the ways that this is a doppelganger for Cabeza de Vaca here. I mean, even from what I've told you, hopefully it's already kind of obvious. But so first off, they said it started 15 or 16 years ago. So by now we're in 1535. 15 or 16 years ago takes us to 1519, the year that the Castilians landed in New Spain and actually landed also in Pánuco, only a few hundred miles south of where we are at this point. Next, the reference to Malacosa as bearded. I mean, that sounds distinctly European. Next, carrying the burning sticks. Who did we just see walking around the countryside with burning sticks? Keep going here. It also sounds a lot like the healing ceremonies that Cabeza de Vaca and his companions have started doing, making the incisions with the rocks and resetting the bones. But there's like a cynical component to it here too, where it's almost like Malacosa is creating the injury and then fixing it. So you almost wonder, is this like a veiled critique that's coming through the Native American version of this? Do they view Cabeza de Vaca as like causing the problems that he's fixing? You know, you kind of get this idea too as it goes on through some of these other things. But so again, Malacosa shows up sometimes dressed like a man, sometimes like a woman. Who else have we seen doing traditional woman's work? Cabeza de Vaca. Let's see. When Malacosa's hosts offer him food, they say, Malacosa often rejects it. Well, who else have we seen declining food? The 4 expeditionaries. They're declining food and giving it away to these other people. And lastly, when they ask where his home is, he points down below the ground. Well, Cabeza de Vaca is apparently walking around telling people that he digs a hole in the ground to sleep in and emerges out of it. I mean, if on the previous slide we kind of just suspected that Cabeza de Vaca was imitating, either consciously or not, some of the imagery and the iconography of this Native American worldview in this place, I mean, I argue in this, he is directly telling us how he has entered and kind of adopted, this persona, this Native, how he has become a part of Native American mythology almost in what he's doing and the story that he's living as he wanders through Mexico. So I'm going to wrap up here, and just to not leave you hanging on the story. Obviously, Cabeza de Vaca does make it back to New Spain. He ends up trekking entirely across the continent, though. He doesn't make it back on the Gulf Coast. He ends up crossing the Continental Divide. They end up over on the Pacific Coast, and somewhere around Culiacan, Sinaloa, is actually where he first reunites with Castilians. And if you want to hear more about this, if you want to hear the 12-hour version, please go check out my podcast. You can hear in more detail, because I'll even argue, too, that the moment when he reunites, our instinct is to want to believe that the climax of the story is when he reunites with his old culture. But I argue it's not. I argue that actually there's a more important council that comes after that, where he really is playing, again, this kind of intermediate role between the European society that he's returned to and between the Native American society that he's become kind of an apostle for. And that's the real climax of the story, is his role as an advocate and as an intermediary, kind of like a skeletonized shaman or something, that I think is the critical part of the story. And that kind of leads me into where I want to wrap up here too, is that, basically there's one theme, there's one word that Cabeza de Vaca returns to over and over in this story, and it's the word naked. Nakedness, desnudo, acueros. It shows up dozens of times. I mean, like the only other substantive noun that shows up more is God. And he uses it kind of as a signpost. I mean, he's naked on the shore of Galveston Island when he arrives there. He's naked in the monte when he's in the brush in his little hole. He's as naked as Adam at a different time. He's as naked as a skeletonized shaman figure. And it's a dual reminder for us of both his physical vulnerability, but also of this posture of extreme openness that he adopts in the course of his journeys, and that starting on Galveston Island. And that what he actually does, it's a survival strategy for him. He makes of himself kind of a blank slate, a tabula rasa. But once you kind of internalize that idea, you have the exhilarating kind of realization that we can actually then see kind of imprinted on that blank slate, on that tabula rasa, some of the worldview and some of the beliefs of the people around him, of the people that he's interacting with. Anyway, that's what I've tried to argue here. So hopefully some real scholars can come along and continue to dig on this even deeper, because I bet there's even more clues. But I wanted to share those with you guys today, and would love to answer any questions if you have any. So thank you.
Sir.
Any questions? Yes.
Kind of your thesis there about him being, your thesis about him being the connection between the old world and the Native Americans. Did you glean most of that from reading his memoir?
Yeah. I mean, the primary source for this is his relación, or the account has a couple different names depending on when it's published. Now, to be clear too, I've also read a bunch of commentaries of them. So I mean, I don't think this isn't me making this assertion. I think this is an idea. For example, some of the other great books. Andrés Reséndez, who's a professor at UC Davis, I think has a great book, a recent one, kind of about him playing this intermediate role. And there's the big study. There's this 3-volume work done by Adorno, I think she's a Yale professor, and Pautz is the other guy's last name, that really teases a bunch of this stuff out. And so, but yeah, I mean, I think the role he comes to adopt is as this intermediary. And what I argue he's ultimately doing in his narrative account is he's both kind of showing off a little bit how he was able to obtain fluency in the Native American mythological idiom and be able to kind of speak that language, but also then too, he's showing Native Americans in a light that his readers back in Castile are going to understand too. Because this goes back to the debate that Rebecca was talking about a little bit earlier. The debate was very active at this point of whether Native Americans were gente con razón, whether they were people of reason, and because that creates certain rights for them under canon law and under Castilian law. And so he's very actively making the argument that they are people with reason. And so this is why one of the reasons I think the council scene that comes after his reuniting with the other Castilians is so important, because in that council, he shows the Native Americans reasoning, theologically reasoning, making arguments, but he's also in that same scene, he's showing his Western audience, his Castilian audience, how the pre-existing Native American beliefs could be understood in almost like a Christian kind of way too. So he's always kind of going back and forth and translating between those two worldviews in a really rich and literary way. Now I'll say, because of the multi-layered and kind of literary richness of this account, some people are skeptics of some of the stuff he says in here. They think it's too literary. It leads them to question, his veracity or his truthfulness in the individual things he says. And again, some of these things do seem kind of too good to be true. I mean, a burning bush in the middle of the brush. But then my point there too is kind of like, fine, we don't have to accept the factuality of it, but he's using it for some important literary device then too, in which case it still has an important meaning that we need to try and understand. Like, what's he trying to signal with that burning bush if it wasn't actually a burning bush? But by the other token too, I mean, there's other people too that think they were just charlatans, that they were just, they had some kind of carnival show that they were going around and, doing, thumb tricks or something and convincing people that they were healing these natives, and that was how they were able to keep moving. But I don't see that. There's something genuine about what they're doing and what they think they're doing. Just like, again, there's people who have put cynical spins on the Franciscans and their missionary work, that really they were just a tool of Castilian imperialism or something. But when you actually read their language, the Franciscans believed what they were doing. They were men of God and in a hurry to meet him. Like they were not afraid to die, not afraid to go out and do what they did. And by the same token, I generally take Cabeza de Vaca at his word here. I mentioned this too. His other two Castilian companions, Dorantes and Castillo, they also wrote their own reports. We've since lost the joint report that the three of them wrote, but we have commentaries of the joint reports. And we know that in general, they tend to coincide in most of the material details. Again, some of the more fantastic ones do only appear in Cabeza de Vaca's account. So, yeah, there's reason to question.
Thank you.
So Cabeza de Vaca, he makes it back to Castile. So he makes it back to Mexico City in 1536. By 1538, he's back in Castile. And here's the real kicker too. He hasn't seen his wife in 10 years. He never has children. He'll never have children. As soon as he gets back, he goes to the king and tries to get a commission to come back to North America. He wants Narvaez's old commission. He wants to come back, and the idea seems to be that he wants to come kind of with this this different kind of conquest. One of my episodes I title, well, and this is a term too that I take from Adorno and Pautz, he wants to accomplish the ideal conquest, a conquest of spirit rather than a conquest of arms. Now, he doesn't get that commission because just a few months before they had given it to De Soto, Hernando de Soto. But he actually does get sent to Argentina, basically. He gets sent as the viceroy, or that's not the right word, like the adelantado, the governor of the Rio de la Plata. He goes down there, and his quirks immediately turn off like all the Castilians that are already there. So so first off, it took him weeks to be able to learn how to sleep in a bed again. Weeks to be able to learn how to wear a shirt. It was scratchy. It was uncomfortable for him. And when he gets down to Argentina, he still refuses to wear shoes. Like it annoys the people around him. And so anyway, he gets on their wrong side. They basically send him back to Castile in chains. They charge him with all kind of things. They charge him with corruption. They charge him with, I don't know, various other crimes. He spends basically the rest of his life in the legal system fighting it. He's actually initially convicted and sentenced to forced labor in Algeria. but that gets overturned. And it seems that he died back in his hometown in Jerez de la Frontera in relative some comfort or something. The reason why we suggest he had some comfort was that he was able to actually ransom one of his nephews that I think had been captured by Turkish pirates or something later on. So he still had some kind of means. So anyway, but he dies back in Castile. We don't know exactly where, but I think the strong belief it's back in Jerez de la Frontera where he was born. So,
got a question over here.
Yes. I'm thinking about, I teach Texas history, and Cabeza de Vaca is really important. I don't have a lot of time, to spend on early Texas necessarily, but we spend at least an entire class period on Cabeza de Vaca. I present him, I think, sort of as this alternative to, Nuño de Guzman, some of the enslavers. Yeah. And I think I sort of put him in the context of Bartolomé de las Casas as these other voices who are speaking out for more humane treatment of the Indians and also for Christianization. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on that, if you think that's the right way to portray him in a class when you have a very limited amount of time.
Totally. I mean, De las Casas uses an early draft of the account actually in his lobbying for there was in 1542, so a couple years after he comes back, is when kind of the most generous Indian welfare law comes out. They had technically forbidden Indian slavery back in 1525. But there were still a bunch of loopholes that you could jump through. So in 1542 was a much more generous, Indian welfare law called. That's the wrong word. I can't remember the full name of the act. But De las Casas is actually using Cabeza de Vaca's account for some of that. Now that said, I think there's complexity to it. Like I don't think you can just make Cabeza de Vaca a saint of this, because again, in his time when he's in Argentina, he's not opposed to enslaving Indians as long as you stick to the law. And this is one of the things that actually gets him crossways with some of the earlier settlers there, is that he'll refuse to enslave friendly and allied Indians. And this is kind of what annoys some of his other countrymen. But he will, Indians that they engage in combat with, that they go to war with, he's not opposed to enslaving those. By the same token, too, the way he ends his account, he shows up in Culiacan and he's got 600 natives behind him, and of his followers. And this actually intimidates the hell out of the guys that he shows up, the Castilians that receive him there, because the Castilians there are slavers. They're actually out there slaving. They're working for Nuño de Guzman. And they're intimidated, and they really want to separate Cabeza de Vaca from his 600 followers, him and Durantes and Castillo and Esteban. And at one point, the natives have this incredible scene where they refuse to let Cabeza de Vaca go with the slavers. They're like, no, those are bad guys, Cabeza de Vaca. Like you don't want to go with them. Like we know what you are, And there's even this beautiful speech that Cabeza de Vaca recreates, where the natives and the slavers kind of get in an argument, and the slavers are trying to say, like, look, these medicine men of yours, they're not medicine men. They're just down on their luck Castilians. Like there's nothing special about these guys. They're like us. They're like us. They're not like you guys. And the natives respond in this wonderful speech. They say, they're not like you guys. You guys come and you bring slavery and you bring sickness and you bring disease. You guys came from where the sun rises. They came from where the sun sets. Like they make all these distinctions, and it's just a smackdown of an argument. And again, it's him demonstrating natives capable of using reason. But again, it's got for me this very colored finish in the story too, because in as much as Cabeza de Vaca prevents them from enslaving his 600 followers at that moment, at least that's how he presents it. And when he goes to this council, he describes how it becomes this great moment of peace, and how after he finishes the council, everyone agrees to be friends, and the sons of the Indians are baptized, and there's crosses that go up in the countryside. And then there's just one peculiar detail of, like, after he leaves you with this moment of triumph, of cinematic, Oscar-worthy redemption or whatever, as they walk into Mexico City, he talks about the great procession that was there to greet him. It was a huge deal. For 100 years, they would remember the return of Cabeza de Vaca into Mexico City. And then just as a throwaway line, he talks about that behind them marched 500 Native Americans in chains. Like, he continues to acknowledge the existence of this slavery, and he's not a saint. He's not even an ideologue per se. What he may have been was just the ultimate civil servant, and that he was just sticking to the letter of the law as it was written. So I don't know, it's nuanced, and it's hard to know where to come down on it. Yeah.
We have a few more minutes, about 5 or so, for questions.
I just wanted to know, I noticed that you used the one route. So have the scholars settled on the route?
Yeah. So, no. And actually, I don't even agree 100% with this route, but this was the better map. So, in the 30s, what was that UT professor's name? Anyway, the route that I grew up with in my textbook kind of had Cabeza de Vaca striking out this way, right? Just across Texas. There was a Mexican historian with a German last name, Kruger, who did some work after. Actually, I think it might have been in the 50s that he did his work, but it's only slowly trickled up. I'm more convinced by Kruger's work, which actually has them trailing down this way and then kind of kicking up this way. And in a way, this makes a lot more sense because this is where they're trying to get, right? And so they knew that if they stayed along the coastline, that they should probably get there. Now, the weird part, you still have to explain this turn. And if you go to my podcast, you can listen to my theories, but it's hard to understand. Ultimately, they were lost, and they didn't really know where they were going. No, they haven't settled on the routes. Texas State has several professors that have written cool stuff on it, including they have a professor of astronomy or physics or something. Olson, what's his name?
Yeah, we actually work with them to create the 3 routes at the time.
Yeah, okay.
He was the astronomer and used a nice guy. That's why I was curious.
But Olson's a critical part of this route because he's proven pretty convincingly that there's a kind of pine nut that Cabeza de Vaca describes in his account, a thin-shelled pine nut that really is only found kind of in the Sierra del Burro up in northern Coahuila up there. And it's certainly, so I've spent a lot of time, I've worked in this part of the world for the last 20 years. And this sounds right to me too, because then he talks about finding a bunch of iron slag, and that was always a problem for the people that kind of took the Fort Davis route, because you don't really have that much iron slag. You have a ton of iron slag right through here. I mean, it's Monclova. It's the old mill town. So anyway, short answer, no. There's no consensus on it, but I'm generally inclined toward more or less this route here. So, yes, sir. Oh, sorry.
I know he talks about the cattle, the grasslands in this San Antonio area being the finest cattle lands he'd ever seen for grass, and then he nearly bled to death. He talked about many times trying to pick firewood, which was sort of the brush of the hill country. But I don't remember anything that seemed similar in Mexico that would divert him way down that way. Kind of kept going toward Colorado, and he talked about finding gourds in the river that were basically, no one knew where the gourds came from, so they considered them most precious possessions with these gourds. And so he would be given gourds all the time because that was the most precious thing they had, because they thought it was something from God.
That's right. And so the gourds, they think, were coming from this culture right here, settled at the Junta de los Rios, which had almost 10,000 people, one estimate, at the time that Cabeza de Vaca came through there. And this, by the way, most people do agree that this point was a point they came through. Like, it's everything here where it gets fuzzy. And so the point about the grasslands, So he does describe those, and for a long time, the evidence that people used was the buffalo. He talks about buffalo too, and for a while, the thinking was that the range of the buffalo never extended much below San Antonio. But they have since established that in different climatic periods, including this one, the buffalo would range all the way down into this part of the area, which opens that up too. And in talking about the brush country again too, for a long time, they used some of the piñón, the pines that were up here as the evidence, but they're thick-skinned. They're thick-skinned. And this was Olson's argument anyway, that a better fit is these here in northern Coahuila. So.
Well, the native Indians in this area talk about this was a turnaround zone for the animals, the seasonal pests. They would come down and spend their winters in the grasslands and turn around and go back up the grasslands up to Canada.
Yeah.
And they would do that every year back and forth, and this is where they turned around. That's why they thought it was so religious an area, because this was the turnaround area.
Sure, and there's some great sites, up by MacArthur High School and stuff like that, that have been sites for thousands of years, where they would sometimes run them off the cliffs and the stuff like that. And so, the route is not conclusive. I mean, no one knows quite for sure. I mean, put it back. No one's quite sure about everything in here. From here on, it seems clearer, and this seems clearer. But yeah, it's kind of in between. It's because either way, it's hard to decide. Like we said, we knew he had some idea that he needed to come this direction. So why in the world did they, in either way, whether they went like this or whether they went like this, why did they turn northwest? I don't know. It's hard to figure out. Part of my argument is that I think they were just being carried along by their followers at that point. They had basically encomendado. They had handed themselves over to God, over to their ministry, and they were just going where they were being taken at that point. It was a part of his nakedness again. A part of his vulnerability and openness was just handing himself over to wherever he was being called to go.
Well, in his reports, he was always talking about trying to get to Mexico City. That was the whole purpose. So it's shocking that we continue to go in a reverse direction.
I agree. It's weird. Yeah. Any other questions?
Listen, thank you so much for a fascinating story.
Thank you all.
Cabeza de Vaca has always been one of the most really compelling stories of Texas and travelers that I've ever heard in my life. And the fact that he survived even the hardships once he went back to Spain is a story unto itself. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.